Amara grew up in Lagos under the care of her wealthy grandmother, a woman of power and elegance who carried her empire with quiet strength. Her parents were alive but never truly there for her. To them, money and status were the only things worth loving. They smiled for society, wore the finest clothes, and treated life like a stage where appearances mattered more than people. Amara was their daughter, yet in their eyes she was nothing more than a shadow. They rarely spoke to her, rarely looked at her, as if she was invisible in her own home. What mattered most to them was the fortune they were certain would one day fall into their hands. They whispered to friends about how the empire would soon belong to them, how the cars, the houses, the companies would all carry their names. Amara, quiet and gentle, was never part of their plan. She sat in corners, reading books or watching her grandmother manage her world with dignity, learning silently from her strength. While her parents fought to be seen in Lagos society, Amara learned what it meant to listen, to endure, to stay calm in the storm of greed around her. In the golden glow of the family's illusion, everyone believed the empire was already promised to her parents. But Amara's grandmother saw what no one else did, the hunger in her children's eyes and the kindness in her granddaughter's heart. And deep inside, she had already made a choice that would shock them all. When Amara's grandmother passed away, the city of Lagos buzzed with whispers. People spoke of the empire she left behind, worth over $80 million. From estates to companies to secret bank accounts, everyone wondered who would take it all. The day of the will reading arrived, set in a glass high-rise that overlooked the sparkling waters of Victoria Island. The building itself seemed like a throne, tall and untouchable, and inside the top floor glowed with chandeliers and velvet chairs. It was a room designed for power. Amara's parents arrived like royalty. Her mother's gown shimmered like liquid gold, and her father's agbada was so heavily embroidered it seemed to weigh him down. They moved through the crowd with wide smiles, shaking hands and greeting distant relatives as if they were already crowned king and queen. Their laughter was loud, their confidence unshaken. Everyone knew they had been waiting for this day, certain the empire would finally fall into their hands. To them, this was not grief, it was triumph. Then Amara entered. She wore a plain dress, nothing more than simple cotton, and flat shoes that made no sound on the polished marble floor. She kept her head low, her steps quiet, and not one jewel shone on her. For a moment, no one noticed her at all. When they did, her mother whispered something sharp, her lips curling. "Look at her. Just baggage," she said, loud enough for others to hear. Her father chuckled, his voice like a knife. "She will beg for scraps." The relatives smirked, glancing at Amara as if her presence was a mistake. Amara did not answer. She walked to the back and sat alone, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Around her, the room buzzed with gossip, the air heavy with perfume and arrogance. Her parents sat at the very front, shoulders lifted, eyes gleaming like hunters ready to claim their prize. They believed the empire was already theirs, and Amara was just a shadow in the corner, someone too quiet to matter. But as the lawyer entered, carrying a sealed envelope, the atmosphere shifted. His shoes clicked against the marble floor, and the laughter began to fade. He placed the envelope on the table, his face calm but unreadable. The parents straightened in their seats, already imagining their names being called, already dreaming of mansions and cars, already picturing their faces on the front pages of Lagos newspapers. Amara remained still, her eyes lowered, but her heart beat against her chest. She had no expectations, no dreams of wealth. All she had was the memory of her grandmother's warm hand holding hers, the lessons whispered late at night about kindness, dignity, and patience. The room around her swelled with pride and greed, but she sat in silence, unaware that in just a few moments, everything about her life, and theirs, was about to change forever. The room was filled with polished shoes, glittering dresses, and the soft hum of conversations. The lawyer was preparing the papers at the front, but the family couldn't sit quietly. Amara's parents, sitting like they were already crowned, had their eyes fixed on the lawyer, waiting to hear their names called. But before anything began, Her mother leaned back in her chair, her voice sharp and cruel, meant for everyone to hear. "Why is she even here?" she said, tilting her chin toward Amara. "She is just baggage. Always was." Laughter bubbled in her throat, light but cutting. Her father joined in with a booming laugh, shaking his head. "She will beg for scraps before this day ends," he declared proudly, as if mocking his own daughter made him stronger. The words carried through the room like smoke. A few cousins covered their mouths to hide smiles. Some uncles and aunties shook their heads with smirks that said Amara was wasting her time. Every eye turned toward her, some pitying, most cruel, treating her presence like an insult, as though she had crashed a celebration where she did not belong. Amara sat quietly at the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face calm but pale. She heard every word, but she didn't flinch. Years of silence had taught her how to carry pain without breaking. Her heart squeezed, yet she kept her gaze on the floor, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her hurt. Her mother's laughter grew louder, pulling in the relatives around her. "Look at her dress," she said mockingly. "Is this what you wear to the most important day of your life? She doesn't even respect the family enough to dress like one of us." Her father chuckled again, eyes twinkling with pride in their own cruelty. The relatives leaned closer to each other, whispering, snickering, their smirks growing wider. To them, Amara was a mistake in the room, someone who had wandered into a world too big for her. But behind the lawyer's serious face, something was waiting. The envelope on the table seemed heavier than paper. It carried truths that no one in the room was expecting. The laughter, the whispers, the mockery filled the air, but the lawyer stayed silent, his hands calmly smoothing out the documents. The smirks around the room grew stronger, the insults sharper, because they all believed the game was already won. Amara sat quietly, her grandmother's words echoing softly in her mind, words of patience and strength. She remembered the warmth in her grandmother's voice, the way she once told her, "Let them talk, my dear. The truth will always rise higher than noise." Amara stayed still, carrying those words inside her heart, unaware that the noise around her was about to shatter, and the very people who mocked her would soon be left speechless. The room went silent when the lawyer finally broke the seal on the thick white envelope. Every eye followed his hand as he carefully unfolded the letter inside. The mocking laughter that had filled the room just moments ago died down. Amara's parents leaned forward, their smiles wide and greedy, ready to hear their names. The relatives straightened too, waiting for confirmation of what they all believed was certain, that the empire belonged to Amara's parents. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read in a steady voice. But as the first line left his lips, the tone in the room shifted. The letter was written in Grandma's own handwriting, and it felt as if her voice was speaking from beyond the grave. "To my family," it began, "I know you have gathered today with expectations. Some of you have waited for this moment more eagerly than you ever waited to see me in life." A nervous shuffle spread through the chairs. Her words cut sharp and true, like she was sitting among them, watching their faces. She went on, exposing what everyone knew but never dared to say aloud. She wrote about her children, how they abandoned her granddaughter Amara, how they worshipped money more than love, how they chased status while neglecting what truly mattered. "You turned away from kindness," the letter continued. "You betrayed the values I built this family on. You ignored the one person who needed you most, because she was not shining with gold in your eyes." Amara's mother's smile began to stiffen. Her father blinked, his hand gripping the armrest. A few relatives lowered their heads, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The lawyer's voice grew stronger as he read the next part. "To my granddaughter Amara, who showed me quiet loyalty, respect, and patience, I leave everything I built. The companies, the estates, the accounts, every piece of my empire belongs to her. She is the rightful heir, for she carries my spirit, not my greed." Gasps tore through the room like a sudden storm. The sound of disbelief echoed against the tall glass walls. Amara's parents froze, their faces draining of color as if someone had ripped the floor out from under them. Her mother's painted smile shattered instantly. Her father's confident laugh was gone, replaced by stunned silence. Relatives who had smirked at Amara just minutes earlier now stared at her in shock, their whispers rushing like waves. Amara sat still, her heart racing, her eyes wide as the words sank in. She had never imagined such a gift, never dreamed that her grandmother had trusted her with everything. The room that had once treated her like invisible baggage now burned with disbelief and envy. And in that heavy silence, Grandma's voice lingered in the letter's final lines, "To those who mocked her, know this, wealth can be inherited, but dignity must be earned." The lawyer paused for a moment, letting the shock of Grandma's words settle in the room. Amara's parents sat frozen, their mouths slightly open, their hands trembling. They were still trying to process the fact that everything had gone to Amara when the lawyer cleared his throat again and said, "But there is more." The room stiffened. Relatives leaned in, eager to hear the next revelation. Amara's mother forced a shaky smile, convincing herself that maybe something else was left for them. Her father sat up straighter, though sweat had begun to bead across his forehead. The lawyer continued reading, and Grandma's voice filled the room once more through her handwritten words. "To my children," the letter said, "you thought you could fool me with your false smiles and empty promises. You hid your reckless debts, your unpaid taxes, and your shady loans, believing I would never know. But I saw it all. I always knew." Gasps rose from the crowd again. Some relatives exchanged shocked glances, whispers cutting through the silence like blades. The lawyer pressed on, his voice calm but merciless. "As your final lesson, I leave all of your debts to you. Every loan, every tax, every hidden bill you thought you could escape, now it belongs to you. You will not inherit wealth. You will inherit the consequences of your own greed." The words landed like a hammer. Amara's mother's face crumbled. Her carefully painted lips trembled, and she clutched her chest as if the air had been knocked out of her. Her father's proud shoulders collapsed, his hands shaking so violently that his expensive watch slid down his wrist. Their glamorous image, the one they wore so proudly, fell apart in an instant. They were not heirs, they were debtors. Relatives who once envied them now looked at them with disgust. Some whispered prayers of pity, others shook their heads, secretly glad the truth had come out. The parents' humiliation filled the room like smoke, suffocating, undeniable. Their eyes darted toward Amara, not with love but with a desperate, bitter rage. They had mocked her, dismissed her, treated her like nothing. Now she sat quietly with the entire empire in her name, while they were left drowning in bills. The father tried to speak, stammering, this can't be legal." But his voice cracked, and the lawyer simply folded the letter and said firmly, "It is binding." It was her will, witnessed and sealed. The silence that followed was louder than any laughter that had filled the room earlier. Amara's parents had walked in like royalty, but they were leaving like beggars. Their crowns of pride had turned to ashes in front of everyone. Amara sat still, her heart heavy but steady. She had not wished them harm, but Grandma's truth had stripped them bare. For the first time in their lives, they had nothing to hide behind, and the empire they once worshipped now belonged to the one they had called baggage. By the next morning, Lagos was buzzing. The news spread like fire on dry grass, jumping from phones to radios to loud conversations in traffic. Headlines screamed across every screen, $80 million empire goes to quiet granddaughter, parents left with debt. In markets, people gossiped over bags of rice. In offices, workers shared the story over cups of tea. Taxi drivers shook their heads in disbelief, telling passengers how greed had destroyed the once glamorous couple. Amara's name was suddenly everywhere, whispered with surprise, spoken with respect. For her parents, the fall was brutal. Their business partners, once eager to shake their hands, now pulled away instantly. Calls went unanswered. Meetings were cancelled. Contracts that had once been their pride were ripped apart overnight. No one wanted to be associated with people carrying debts like chains. The glamorous image they had spent years building collapsed in hours. The fancy clothes, the fake smiles, the loud laughter. All of it became a mask no one believed anymore. They had mocked their daughter in public, and now the whole city mocked them in return. At the family mansion, the humiliation deepened. The very house they had boasted about for years was no longer theirs. Notices came quickly, demanding they vacate. Neighbors who used to envy them now stood outside in silence, watching as movers carried out furniture and clothes. The golden gates that once opened to cars and flashing cameras now opened to shame. Amara's parents tried to keep their heads high, but whispers followed them everywhere. People pointed, children laughed, and their pride crumbled piece by piece. Meanwhile, Amara returned quietly, not in a parade, but in calm dignity. Workers at the mansion welcomed her with warm smiles, some even with tears, remembering how kind she had always been even when her parents ignored her. For the first time, the gates opened for her as the rightful heir, not as an invisible shadow. She walked through the halls where she had once felt small, and this time she felt the weight of her grandmother's trust. The empire was hers, not as a prize of revenge, but as a responsibility to carry forward with honor. The city took notice. News anchors praised her humility. Social media celebrated her story, calling it a lesson in patience and justice. The quiet girl became the queen, one headline said. People admired her strength, the way she didn't gloat or boast, but simply stepped into her role with grace. Her parents, now stripped of power, stood outside the gates one last time. They had dreamed of glory, but all they inherited was shame. Lagos had turned its back on them, while their daughter, the one they called baggage, had become the symbol of dignity. In their downfall, her light only grew brighter. The room was still heavy with silence when Chief Obi cleared his throat and spoke again, this time louder, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment. He looked straight at Chike and his family, his expression calm but unshakable. From this day forward, he said slowly, everything I own will be transferred into my daughter Amara's name. She will be the rightful owner of all my lands, estates, and businesses. No one else will have any claim to it. His words struck like lightning, and the shock on their faces was almost painful to watch. Chike's father dropped back into his chair as though the strength had left his body. Chike's mother pressed her hands together, whispering, "No, this cannot be." Chike himself looked like a man drowning. He scrambled for words, trying to smile, trying to act as if all his cruelty had been nothing but a misunderstanding. "Amara, my love," he stammered, "you know I was only joking all those times. You know I have always cared for you. We were wrong to treat you that way. Please, forgive us." His brothers and sisters joined in, their proud voices suddenly soft, begging for mercy. The same family that had mocked her worth now fought desperately to hold on to their pride. But Chief Obi was already 2 steps ahead of them. Without their knowledge, he had invited the press. And right at that moment, cameras and microphones began flooding the room. Reporters snapped pictures, recording every face, every plea, every desperate word. The flash of cameras lit up the dining hall, and the cruel family who once bragged about their power was now caught in the spotlight of shame. Their arrogance had been their mask, and it was being torn away for the whole city to see. The reporters quickly realized what was happening. The poor girl, mocked by her in-laws, was in fact the heiress of one of the greatest fortunes in Lagos. And the proud family who had treated her like nothing were now groveling in front of her, their empire of pride crumbling right before the eyes of the world. Questions flew through the air, microphones were shoved in faces, and the humiliation of Chike's family was sealed forever. Amara sat quietly, her head lifted high, her silence more powerful than their desperate cries. She no longer needed to defend herself. The truth spoke louder than any words she could say. Chief Obi rested a gentle hand on her shoulder, his face proud and steady, while the cameras captured the image that would spread across the city by morning, a daughter rising, and a cruel family falling. By the time the reporters left, Chike and his family were broken. Their name, once spoken with pride, was now covered in disgrace. Their reputation was ruined, their arrogance destroyed, and their cruelty exposed. Amara, the woman they once called worthless, had become the very symbol of power and dignity. And nothing they said or did could change it. Months passed, and the story of Amara had become one of the most talked about in Lagos. People admired how she turned her grandmother's empire into a source of hope instead of greed. When the night of the charity gala arrived, the ballroom sparkled with golden lights, chandeliers hanging like stars, and music floating softly in the air. Powerful men and women filled the room, dressed in their finest, waiting to see the new chairwoman. When Amara walked in, all eyes turned to her. She wore a simple but elegant gown, nothing flashy, yet her calm presence carried more weight than the glittering jewels around her. Cameras clicked, people whispered her name, and she moved gracefully to the stage. In the crowd, hiding in the back, sat her parents. Their clothes were no longer rich and shining, their faces no longer proud. They looked smaller now, shadows of the people who once walked with their heads high. They had lost everything, but the greatest wound was being forced to watch their daughter shine where they had failed. When Amara was announced as the new chairwoman, applause filled the room, echoing like thunder. Reporters rushed forward, microphones ready, and one asked loudly, "Do you have anything to say to your parents tonight?" The hall grew silent, everyone waiting for her reply. Amara's eyes found them in the crowd. For a brief moment, she looked at the very people who had mocked her, who had once called her baggage. Then she smiled gently, saying nothing. Her silence carried more power than words could. The crowd understood. Her parents understood. And in that moment, the whole city knew the truth: Amara had won, not with anger, but with grace.